Today, I would like to discuss the Drosera or Sundews, particularly as Darwin appreciated them. In front of you are two Sundews. The first is Drosophila Formas, and the second is Drosera Lanata. I'll talk about Drosophila Formas first. It's commonly known as the thread-leaved sundew. Its natural range extends down the eastern seaboard of North America, from southwest Nova Scotia in the north, down through New England and Florida in the south. The plants from Florida are generally smaller and redder than those from the Atlantic coast. Northern filiformis varieties require a definite winter season to survive long term. If they are not catching many insects on their own, dried bloodworms, as used in fish food, can be used. However, for many Drosera species, wingless fruit flies are the ideal food. This filiformis appears to be from the northern variety because it is not particularly reddish. The other species is compact. It's Drosera Lanata. It's endemic to Australia, the Northern Territory, and Queensland in particular. Its leaves are arranged in a compact basal rosette. Narrow linear petioles, less than 2 millimeters wide, here we see them here, very long, emerge from the center of the rosette and hold carnivorous leaves at the end, and you can see them here clearly in red. Both petioles and the center of the rosette are densely covered in tiny silvery hairs. These insulate the plant and allow it to trap morning dew for additional moisture during the dry season. This is an example of a sundew that inhabits a drier climate, and there are not too many of these. Drosera Lanata was formally described only in 1984, and the type specimen was collected in 1982. Many more discoveries await. Modern readers of espionage novels, or viewers of these movies, will know the term honeypot or honey trap as referring to seduction with an ulterior motive. The term meant something different, very different, a century ago, as presented in a 1916 book entitled Europa's Fairy Tales. There's an image that accompanies the tale of the Cinder Maid, and I quote, and it follows the image. When Cinder Maid went to the ball, the prince would dance with none but her, and when midnight came round, she fled as before. But the prince, hoping to prevent her running away, had ordered the soldiers at the foot of the staircase to pour out honey on the stairs, so that her shoes would stick in it. But Cinder Maid leaped from the stair to stair and got away just in time. The natural world also uses honey traps, and Darwin was caught. But before we discuss Darwin, let's discuss the traps. Sundews are flypaper plants that trap prey in sticky hairs on their leaves. They make up one of the largest groups of carnivorous plants, so it can be inferred that these plants are good at trapping insects in relation to the energy they expend to trap them. Drosera, commonly known as sundews, is a group of over 190 plant species. And as we understand, there are some being discovered even now. Sundews are native to every continent except Antarctica. Both the botanical name, from the Greek drosos equals dew or dewdrops, and the English common name, sundew, derived from Latin ros solis, meaning dew of the sun, sundews are typically perennial, or rarely annual herbaceous plants, forming prostrate or upright rosettes. And as we saw before, this upright species is rather atypical. Most sundews are more like this. The trapping and digestion mechanism usually employs two types of glands: stalked glands that secrete sweet, shiny glue to attract and ensnare insects and enzymes to digest them, and sessile glands that absorb the resulting nutrient soup. Small prey, mainly insects, are attracted by sweet secretions. Upon touching these glue-tipped tentacles, the prey become entrapped. Death usually occurs within 15 minutes. All species of sundew are able to move their tentacles in response to contact with edible prey. The tentacles are extremely sensitive and will bend towards the center of the leaf to bring the insect into contact with as many stalked glands with their tiny blobs of glue as possible. The weight of a small gnat on a single tentacle is enough to induce this response. The outer tentacles of some species can bend inwards towards prey in a matter of seconds after contact. Of these, Drosera capensis exhibits what is probably the most dramatic movement, curling its leaf completely around prey in 30 minutes. The exact physiological mechanism of the sundew's carnivorous response is not yet known, but some studies have begun to shed light on how the plant is able to move in response to mechanical and chemical stimulation to envelop and digest prey. Individual tentacles, when mechanically stimulated, fire action potentials that terminate near the base of the tentacle, resulting in rapid movement of the tentacle towards the center of the leaf. This response is more prominent when marginal tentacles further away from the leaf center are stimulated. There is a paper available online by Andrei Pavlovich et al. Titled "Feeding on Prey Increases Photosynthetic Efficiency in the Carnivorous Sundew Drosera capensis." It's in the Annals of Botany for 2014. The takeaway of this article are two main points. The suggestion that the rate of photosynthesis increases in response to prey capture and nutrient uptake is true. Plants that feed on insects had greater leaf tissue in about 10 weeks. It can be noted that the feeding experiment had to continue over several weeks and involved multiple fruit flies. Several other studies apparently did not conduct the experiment for long enough to see a growth differential. Leaf nitrogen and phosphorus levels increased after feeding. Carnivorous plants have adapted to grow in places where the soil is thin or poor in nutrients, especially nitrogen, such as acidic bogs. One of the best-known adaptations is that of plant symbiosis with nitrogen-fixing bacteria. This is the major route by which nitrogen is incorporated into plant biomass. A portion of this plant-associated nitrogen is then lost to insects through herbivory, and insects represent a nitrogen reservoir that is generally overlooked in nitrogen cycles. And a reason for this is, of course, if you don't consider carnivorous plants, insects simply run away with the nitrogen they ate from plants. The second take-home point is that the coloration of tentacles, the pink or red coloration of the tentacles, did not attract fruit fly prey into traps. I'll then discuss a little bit about growing sundews. Many tropical sundews can be quite adaptable and can thrive in a sunny windowsill. If grown outdoors, the temperature should not drop below 55 degrees Fahrenheit or 13 degrees centigrade. Freezing temperatures will kill them quickly. Almost all sundews require lots of light, several hours of bright, direct sunlight, and lots of filtered light. Light may be supplemented by LED plant lights to a total of about 14 hours of light. Winter care. Cold-hardy sundews, like European sundews, require 3 to 4 months of winter dormancy. This phase is triggered by cold temperatures below about 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius, and fewer hours of light. As plants enter dormancy, they will drop their leaves and stop growing altogether. They form a rosette of small, non-sticky leaves. While dormant, the plant can withstand overnight frosts down to about 20 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 7 degrees Celsius. Even while dormant, plants cannot dry out and must sit in a small amount of standing water, which brings us naturally to water, which is a very important consideration. All sundews require mineral-free water, and almost all require constant moisture in the bottom of the pot. It can always be sitting in water. If the tap water is relatively pure, which is less than about 50 parts per million in dissolved minerals, then it can be used. Rainwater can also be stored, and distilled water can be used. In distillation, the water is boiled and then the steam is captured. The steam is condensed, and this condensate, which is purified and distilled. Distilled water is not the same as boiled water. Reverse osmosis can also be used to purify water. It is a process in which the water molecules are forced through a semi-permeable membrane by a pressure differential. Simply using a cartridge to purify water is not usually enough. Soil is relatively straightforward, a mixture of 1 part peat moss to 1 part perlite. Never use general purpose potting soil. Compost or fertilizer can quickly kill sundews. And finally, we can discuss sundews in traditional medicine. Sundews were used as medicinal herbs in Europe as early as the 12th century. It has been used commonly in cough preparations in Germany and on the continent, a trend which continues today. Sundew tea can be recommended by herbalists for dry coughs, bronchitis, whooping cough, asthma, and bronchial cramps. The Voynich manuscript is named after the Polish-American antiquarian book dealer who acquired the book in 1912. It is written in a Romance language, but the contents have remained elusive. It has inspired much interest from alternative historians who want to believe that it contains occult knowledge. Nearly every page of the manuscript contains scientific and botanical drawings. The vellum used in the book was carbon dated to 1404 to 1438. It has been the subject of recent scholarship that has cleared up some of the mystery. Gerard Cheshire wrote The Language and Writing System of MS 408, Voynich Explained. It's in Romance Studies, published online April 29, 2019. Dr. Cheshire identified the language and writing system of the manuscript. He found it was written in Proto-Romance, ancestral to today's Romance languages, including Portuguese, Spanish, French, Italian, Romanian, Catalan, and Galician. The language was used in the Mediterranean during the medieval period, but it was seldom written in official or important documents because Latin was the language of royalty, church, and government. As a result, Proto-Romance was lost from the record until now. Translations by Dr. Cheshire reveal that the manuscript is a compendium of information on herbal remedies, therapeutic bathing, and astrological readings concerning matters of particular interest to women. Historians have surmised that the manuscript was compiled by a Dominican nun as a source of reference for Maria of Castile, Queen of Aragon, the great aunt of Catherine of Aragon. The manuscript has a wonderful drawing of what looks like an oblong-leaved sundew, or Drosera intermedia. The first line of the accompanying text reads, "The pregnancy, baby, it's to acquire good growth as for normal birth." Drosera contain substances known as flavonoids and quinones, which have an antibiotic, antiviral, and antimicrobial and antifungal effect, so they would have helped to ward off infections during pregnancy. It is no surprise Darwin was entranced by sundews, and there are many more discoveries waiting for patient researchers. This afternoon, I would like to say a few things about Charles Darwin and his interest in carnivorous plants. In fact, the father of the modern theory of evolution was very interested in carnivorous plants, and this is an aspect of his career that seems to be forgotten by many people. Charles Darwin was born in 1809 and lived until 1882. His theory is that all species of life have descended over perhaps a very great span of time from common ancestors. He had an unconventional start as a naturalist, but eventually he fell in with the right people. An example is a letter he wrote to Charles Lyell. Charles Lyell lived from 1797 to 1875. He wrote Principles of Geology, Elements of Geology, and The Antiquity of Man, which was published in 1863. These books appeared in many editions. He was a respected academic, a professor of geology at King's College London, and he was also a public intellectual. He was knighted in 1848 and created a baronet in 1864. Quite an achievement for a scientist of any age. Charles Darwin wrote to Lyell on 24 November 1860. He was talking about the reception of his book on the origin of species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. He was concerned that people were contesting his findings, and in fact, in the popular press, he was getting a lot of personal attacks. It was also clear that despite some naysayers, the public had an insatiable appetite for evolution. His publisher was encouraging him to prepare a third edition of The Origin of Species. But the reason he didn't prepare the third edition is outlined in the letter, and I'll read a section. This letter is available online. But I will and must finish my Drosera manuscript, which will take me a week, for at this present moment, I care more about Drosera than the origin of all the species in the world. But I will not publish on Drosera till next year, for I am frightened and astounded at my results. In fact, due to the popularity of his evolutionary thesis, and due to his continued experiments on carnivorous plants, he delayed publication until 1875. He goes on to state in the letter, "Is it not curious that a plant should be far more sensitive to a touch than any nerve in the human body? Yet I am perfectly sure that this is true. When I am on my hobby horse, I never can resist in telling my friends how well my hobby goes, so you must forgive the writer." Darwin here is talking about sundews, which, because they have tentacles and sticky arms, they're very easy to observe. It's very easy to conduct experiments to see what kind of foods these plants like and how they react to various substances. But before we go down that road, we can return to Charles Darwin's student days. At Cambridge, Darwin became a friend of John Stephen Henslow, who lived from 1796 to 1861. He was a botanist and geologist, but he is best remembered as being Darwin's friend and mentor. The two met in 1828. Earlier that year, Darwin, with other students, helped to collect local plants. This was an interest Darwin had since childhood. There is a famous painting of the 7-year-old Charles Darwin in 1816 by Ellen Sharples. This has Darwin holding a potted plant with a very satisfied look on his face. Henslow became Darwin's tutor, and it was not long before he marked out Darwin as a promising student. In 1830, Henslow experimented on varying the conditions of garden-grown wild plants to produce various forms of the plant. In 1835, Henslow published Principles of Descriptive and Physiological Botany as a textbook based on his lecture course. In the summer of 1831, Henslow was offered a place as a naturalist to sail aboard the survey ship HMS Beagle on a 2-year voyage to survey South America, but his wife dissuaded him from accepting. Seeing a perfect opportunity for his protege, Henslow wrote to the ship's captain, Robert Fitzroy, telling him that Darwin was the ideal man to join the expedition team. During the voyage, Darwin corresponded with Henslow and collected plants with him in mind. In fact, Darwin's first phase aboard the ship, and its many places where it stopped, was collecting plants. Darwin only gradually expanded to collecting many, many forms of life that were brought back and served as type specimens that are now stored in Britain. It also stimulated his interest in evolution, and his book was not far forthcoming. The rest, as they say, is history. Darwin began his work with insectivorous plants in the mid-1860s, though his findings were not published until 1875. In his autobiography, Darwin reflected on the delay that allowed him to refine his work. The delay in this case, as with all my other books, has been a great advantage to me, for a man after a long interval can criticize his own work almost as well as if it were that of another person. Several decades after he began this work, Darwin was clearly able to see that a plant should secrete a fluid closely analogous to the digestive fluid of an animal. He realized that plants and animals might not be so far apart. The resulting volume, Insectivorous Plants, was one of a series of works in which Darwin explored the reaches of natural selection. This work allowed Darwin to focus on the features of insectivorous plants that allowed them to survive in difficult environments. Darwin used several experiments to stimulate the plants' trap mechanisms, including feeding them meat, blowing on them, and stimulating them with hair. And again, the Sundew was a perfect experimental plant. Obviously, in something with a pitcher trap, you would have to cut open the pitcher to see what was going on. In the case of a Venus flytrap, obviously, the leaf prevents you from seeing what's going on. With a Drosera or Sundew, you can see very clearly what is going on, and you can time how long it takes the leaves or the tentacles to respond. Through his work, Darwin concluded that plants would only react to movements of prey. Darwin believed that this was a wonderful adaptation for the plants as it enabled them to ignore unhelpful stimuli. He concluded that this was an evolutionary adaptation to conserve energy for prey and to ignore stimuli that were not likely to be nutritious. He also discovered that while some plants have a distinct trap-like structure, others produce sticky fluids to ensure their prey, and concluded that this was an example of natural selection, pressure resulting in various methods of food capture. From his initial observations in 1860, of Drosera rotundifolia, the common sundew, Darwin developed a series of experiments ultimately establishing how excellently adapted these plants are to catching insects. Darwin knew that these plants flourish in nitrogen-limited environments, growing in bogs, poor peaty soil, and moss. Most plants receive nutrients from the soil by their roots, but carnivorous plants have a poor root system and are adapted to receive nutrients, primarily nitrogenous substances, from captured insects. And as we know, carnivorous plants are also capable of feasting on vertebrates. Darwin found the sensitivity of the glands to slight pressure and to minute doses of nitrogenous substances. Plants do not respond to heavy rain falling on them, nor to the wind blowing on them. They have adapted well to insects alighting on them, and this saves them from wasting energy through excess movement. The power to digest nitrogenous substances by secreting digestive matter and then absorbing them. He noted that digestion follows a similar pattern to animal processes, in that acid is added to ferment the nutrient source. This is the equivalent to pepsin. His monograph is an excellent example of his interest in scientific collaboration with other naturalists and experts. In particular, he worked with Professor Edward Frankland of the Royal College of Chemistry in designing and executing some of the key experiments. Darwin's sons, George and Francis, helped him with the illustrations for the volume, each working up illustrations. And in fact, the volume is well worth anyone's time to see the level of Victorian scholarship. Darwin also corresponded with the New Jersey naturalist Mary Treat about carnivorous plants. She lived from 1830 to 1923. She's best known as an entomologist. Over 28 years, she wrote 76 scientific and popular articles, as well as 5 books. Her book, Injurious Insects of the Farm and Field, originally published in 1882, was reprinted 5 times, in part because it's written so that an average person can understand it, rather than using complex academic language. Darwin and Treat exchanged 15 letters from 1871 to 1876 about the behavior and mechanisms of carnivorous plants. Darwin corresponded more with Treat than with any other female naturalist. He was so impressed with Treat's work on carnivorous plants that he referenced her both within the main text and in the footnotes. Now, if we skip to today, what is it that carnivorous plants are showing us? Well, they're showing us many things, but specifically, in the late 1980s, scientists discovered that carnivorian plants evolved independently 6 or more times within 5 separate orders of plants. In other words, there was not a single carnivorous plant ancestor that can be traced far back. It was a number of different plants in the past. Most species of carnivorous plants are only distantly related to each other, and they evolved to become carnivorous in a variety of geographical regions from unrelated organisms of origin. This is called convergent evolution, where organisms that are distantly related or monophyletic develop similar traits to adapt to environments with many of the same conditions. And for carnivorous plants, this is basically poor soil. This was just one more reason why Darwin was so enthralled with insect-devouring plants. And I'm sure the coming decades will find many other surprises. Thank you very much for your time.